Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's 2020 IEPR Update Commissioner Workshop on plans for updating the California Energy Demand 2019-2030 forecast. I'm Heather Raitt, the Program Manager for the Integrated Energy Policy Report, which we refer to as the IEPR. Today's workshop is being held remotely, consistent with Executive Orders N2520 and N2920, and the recommendations from the California Department of Public Health to encourage physical distancing to slow the spread of COVID-19. Instructions for attending or participating in the meeting were provided in the notice and are include both internet and call-in options. And the notice is available on the Energy Commission's webpage. So instead of what used to be our normal full-day IEPR workshop, we've split this topic into 2 sessions to encourage participation and avoid Zoom fatigue. This morning's session is on economic and demographic scenarios, electricity rates, and self-generation. And session 2 was this afternoon. It starts at 2, and that's going to be on electric vehicle adoption and charging scenarios. And there's a separate login required for this afternoon. And so I'll just repeat again, this afternoon it starts at 2. We put out a notice on Monday, changing that time from 1 to 2 o'clock. All IEPR meetings are recorded. A copy of this recording and a written transcript will be available, and copies of the presentations today are docketed and are posted on the Energy Commission's website. So we're working on making these IEPR workshops more engaging in this remote environment, and we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom with the capability to vote on questions posed by others. So what you can do is type in a question for panelists by clicking on the Q&A icon. And then before typing a question, please check to see if someone else has already posed a similar question. And if so, you can click on that thumbs up to vote on it. And questions with the most thumbs up are upvoted to the top of the list. So we'll reserve about 5 minutes at the end of each presentation for attendee Q&A. And given time restrictions, we're unlikely to elevate all questions received. Now I'll go over how to submit public comments on today's materials. There's going to be an opportunity for public comment at the end of the morning and the afternoon sessions. So please note we will not have time for today's speakers to answer questions during that public comment period. Click the raise hand icon to let us know you'd like to make a comment if you've accessed Zoom online. And if you're on the phone, you just press *9 to raise your hand. And alternatively, written comments are welcome, and they are due on September 16th. And the notice gives you all the information for submitting written comments. And with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner McAllister for opening remarks. Thank you.
Hello there, sorry. Thanks, Heather, really appreciate it. Been looking forward to this workshop, and you know, I think I know that staff have done a tremendous amount of work to prepare for today, and really overall on the demand update, the forecast update. And you know, you'll hear from the staff presentations, you know, what today's topics are specifically, and they are specific topics. And I wanted to provide just a tad of context for today's session. You know, in the morning we're going to be talking about the econ demo, really the broader economic issues and demographic issues that are affecting the state. And you know, as this is an update year, it's not a full forecast. This work really takes the 2019 forecast and tweaks it a bit for any changes that have happened in the meantime. And of course, all of us know that massive changes have happened with COVID, with the economic contraction, and all of the trauma that our society broadly is living through right now, and that we're all dealing with every day. So in that sense, it'll be really interesting to hear what folks have to say this morning and how that's impacting what we think the electricity demand is going to do. You know, in contrast to what we thought in the 2019 forecast. And then in the afternoon, we're going to talk about the specifics of the transportation forecast update. You know, obviously in the recent, you know, the last 10 days, last couple weeks have been challenging in terms of the heat wave that we saw, the fires. You know, the conversation has been a much more public one than typically, you know, when the lights go out as they did the previous Friday and Saturday, you know, that's obviously not a good thing. We need to keep looking at unpacking what happened and adjusting our planning and our work products and our joint agency conversations to account for that. Those conversations are happening. Many of the attendees will have seen the letter that the three agencies sent to the governor last week. And that lays out a plan for how we're going to move forward, studying these issues and figuring out how to adjust our planning. Those are really broader issues, different issues than what we're going to talk about today. Obviously, they're very important, and we're laying out a plan for near-term analysis and then longer-term tweaks to our planning processes. So certainly pay attention to those conversations. But those are not conversations that are happening today. Today, we're talking about a couple of specific forecast elements for the 2020 forecast update. So wanted to just be clear about that. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about within the morning session on Econ Demo and lots of exciting sort of implications for what's happening in the transportation sector in the afternoon. So looking forward to both of those topics. And thanks everybody for attending. I want to just give kudos to staff, both in the assessments division, the forecast team. They're doing an amazing job under duress, and including helping to stir up new resources across the grid to keep the lights on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of last week. Really yeoman's work for really rolling up sleeves and getting involved really to help make sure that our grid was supported in any way possible together with the ISO and the PUC. And then also wanted to give kudos to Heather and her team for keeping the IEPR train running down the track under obviously challenging circumstances and really making the online tools work for us and using them to great benefit, I think. So thanks all of you for participating, and thanks to the commission team for enhancing the platform and utilizing it to great effect. So with that, I will pass on if the chair is on for comments. If not, then Vice Chair Scott.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our IEPR workshop this morning. I don't have much to add other than I just really want to echo what you heard from Commissioner McAllister. One of the things that I'm looking forward to learning more about is what's changed in the Econ Demo with COVID, and how are we capturing that, and how will we kind of balance that out going forward as we look towards what we think the changes will be in the future with the impacts that COVID has had. And I also just want to echo the thanks that Commissioner McAllister laid out, both for our IEPR team and for our analysis shop. They're doing a fantastic job. So I want to thank them very much, and also thank Commissioner McAllister for his leadership in this space. There is a lot of attention to detail, a lot of minutia, a lot of thoughts about assumptions and how to make them correctly, how to capture this, and they do it very well. So I wanted to thank Commissioner McAllister for his leadership, as well as our analysis team and the IEPR shop. So thank you very much. I look forward to today.
All right, well, I'll jump in with some quick introductions too. This is Commissioner Douglas. I join in my colleagues' comments and just wanted to add that, the energy demand forecast is one of the most important things the Energy Commission does. And it serves as a foundation to many of our policies. It serves as just foundational information for us in achieving our energy goals, reliability, achieving the state's climate goals, and moving forward successfully across the board with a range of programs here. So I'm, very interested in hearing what we have to say here, what we have learned, how things have changed, and what maybe may not have changed as much as we think. It's obviously been a year of a lot of change, and I'll be really interested to see how that is reflected in the forecast. So with that, just thanks to the staff and to my colleagues.
Well, good morning, folks. This is Commissioner Monahan. Just want to make a few final comments before we dive into the substance. As Commissioner McAllister said, this is really an extraordinary time in our state's history. We're dealing with a pandemic, a global pandemic, and all the economic and social implications of that. We're dealing with wildfires and air pollution that is really exacerbating the our already pretty extraordinary air pollution challenges in the state. And this demand forecast really is an incredibly important planning tool for the state as we move forward with transportation electrification and meeting the state's goals for climate and clean energy. So like my fellow commissioners, I just want to thank the Energy Assessments Division for their extraordinary work in the last couple of weeks, as well as with this demand forecast, and in the midst of all the work that they have been doing, they've also been really making progress on a new tool that's going to be released soon on sharing data on energy, including transportation electrification data. So they've really done an amazing amount of work and handled a lot of challenges ably and with professionalism. So I just want to thank the team for all that they have done, and thank Commissioner McAllister for his leadership in the space. And I'm really looking forward to this morning and this afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Great. This is Heather. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Nick Fugate from the Energy Commission, and Nick oversees the core team responsible for developing many of the major components of the demand forecast with support from nearly every unit within the Energy Assessments Division. Go ahead, Nick.
Thank you. So good morning, commissioners, and thank you for your comments. And thank you to everyone else for joining the call. In just a few minutes, we're going to hear from our technical staff, who will describe the work that's been done and that is still underway to update our 2019 IEPR demand forecast, which was adopted in January of this year. But as the commissioners have mentioned, this last week has been particularly unusual. And so in case we are joined today by folks who are not yet familiar with our process, I thought I'd start off with just some additional context. And so can we go to my third slide, please? So the Energy Commission develops 10-year forecasts of end-user electricity and natural gas demand for use in state planning and policy analysis. These are sometimes referred to as the IEPR forecast. In each full IEPR cycle, we produce a completely new demand forecast. And then in each IEPR update cycle, we update that forecast. Staff will commonly refer to the forecast as the California Energy Demand Forecast, or CED for short. These are different names for the same thing. CED 2019 refers to the demand forecast adopted by the Commission as part of the 2019 IEPR. This is the forecast that we're updating this year. But it's not actually a single forecast. We produce a number of forecasts all at once. Forecasts of annual, hourly, and peak demand by utility planning area, or the CAISO control area, or the state as a whole. And we develop baseline scenarios, which reflect a reasonable range of possible economic conditions. And we develop scenarios around future programs and policies that have a high level of policy commitment and are therefore likely to happen, but for which there's still a lot of uncertainty around timing and implementation. We call these additional achievable scenarios. And for our peak forecasts, we adopt different weather variants, a 1 and 2 forecast, which represents peak demand under normal weather conditions. The idea being that in any given year, you're equally likely to see higher or lower peak load than what is forecasted, depending on whether it's a warm or mild summer. But also a 1 and 5, a 1 and 10, and a 1 and 20 forecast, representing peak demand that you can expect under more extreme conditions, like the heat storm that Western states experienced last week. And we do all this so that planners have options, so that they can use combinations of scenarios that best suit their particular study requirements. And how about slide 4? This framework is actually detailed in every recent IEPR. Leadership at the CEC, CPUC, and ISO document which combinations of adopted baseline scenario, additional achievable scenario, and peak weather variant are going to be used in the next round of planning. This is referred to as the single forecast set agreement, and as you can see on this slide, it varies by study. Resource adequacy at the system level makes use of our mid-baseline, mid-AAEE, scenarios and our most likely 1 and 2 peak forecast. Local capacity studies, for example, assume lower levels of future efficiency and plan to more extreme weather conditions. This is just an illustrative selection of use cases, though. Anyone who is interested can find a more comprehensive and detailed list in the 2019 IEPR by following this link here. Slide 5. And on a related note, much of what we do is in response to specific stakeholder needs. As circumstances change, as planning processes evolve, so does our forecast. The additional achievable framework I mentioned earlier arose over a decade ago in response to the CPUC's renewed and enduring commitment to IOU efficiency programs. Our hourly forecast is a relatively new product and was necessary to capture the effects of a shifting peak hour resulting from significant and increasing penetration of behind-the-meter PV. We've added climate change impacts in recent years, leveraging work most recently from the state's 4th climate change assessment. And there are more changes to come. The CPUC has moved toward more probabilistic reliability assessments in IRP. And so we're looking to support this by providing distributions of hourly loads rather than just an expected case. And slide 6. Lastly, I want to cover the scope of what we're intending to do with this update. I suppose I could have included this as a bullet on the last slide because we haven't always done an update. Our forecast process used to be a 2-year cycle, but a decade ago, the Great Recession really illustrated that when you're on an annual planning cycle and economic conditions change drastically and suddenly, you don't really want to be waiting around for 2 years for a new set of inputs. So we started updating the forecast in off-cycle years, but it's an update to the existing forecast and it will retain many of its original characteristics. Our focus is on the high impact elements, and so we limit the update to electricity demand only. Use of econometric models and the latest econ demo scenarios available to update our sector forecasts. We benchmark to the most recent historical loads and interconnection data and sometimes refresh projections for key demand modifiers. So this is what we're here to talk about today, about some of the data, tools, assumptions we plan to use. Some of our presenters will have partial or preliminary results to show, but we're still early in our process. What we don't cover here in detail, we look forward to reviewing with stakeholders through our demand analysis working group in the coming months. And with that, I'm happy to turn things over to our first presenter.
Good morning. This is Kerry Garcia, the lead forecaster in the Demand Analysis Office. You can stick here on this first slide. So this is sort of my outline. As Nick mentioned, we have our CED, and so since we're doing an update this year, it's a CEDU 2020 for our forecast year. So Nick covered most of the background. I might touch on a little bit throughout the presentation today, but mostly going to stick to the process. What the demand cases are, these new demand cases, now that we've had seen, or we're sort of expecting, given the circumstances and the results of COVID-19 on our economy. And as Nick mentioned, we have some preliminary analysis that we can show. You can go to the next slide, please. But before I get into that, I just have a few notes here on COVID-19. I know that's probably on the top of everybody's mind, given the changes to our economy. So our update process, was designed to account for changes in economic trends, but obviously this recent pandemic is something quite different than what we've previously experienced. Obviously, nobody had this, nobody was predicting 2020 to turn out this way by any means. And so, we may have heard that there could be some structural changes, some behavioral changes that we're all still trying to understand regarding energy usage. Nationally as well as in California. But as we get more information and data on this, we can better ascertain if there, is a particular trend that we need to account for, or any behavior that may be changing and that we can expect to remain changed in the future. But right now, I think it's a little too difficult for us to make any concrete predictions about that. little too early to say, whether these existing conditions will, exist in some form in the future, or if we essentially just revert back to our pre-pandemic habits. So 2020 isn't over yet, so it makes a lot of sense to tackle these questions as we gear up for 2021 forecast. We'll have, more data to study this and determine how we may need to recalibrate our models for future projections. But the one caveat for this year is that we can bring in as much data as we can get for 2020. So that's essentially January through September data. We'll have access to that. And we can kind of recalibrate and adjust our starting point to account for, what the data looks like right now. But that still, remains to be seen for the remainder of the few more months we have left in the year. But I think this will give us a better sense of, where we're headed in the future. And obviously the results today were pretty preliminary and partial, and I'll explain some of the caveats with the analysis, but they should be helpful for discussion, and we're more than happy to discuss this through our DAWG, our Demand Analysis Working Group. Next slide, please. And so just a little bit about the process itself. I know Nick touched on a few of these, so I won't spend too much time here. As he mentioned, we do these updates to support the CPUC and KISO processes. So this started around 2014 or so as we were coming out of the last recession. In prior updates, we actually used these econometric models to, actually the off cycles we used to tune our econometric models, which were run alongside our end use sector models, and mostly for comparisons and other additional analysis that we need to conduct. But this process is slowly becoming more intensive. Now these econometric models are used for these updates. And initially we didn't update our self-generation EV forecast. We simply updated the baseline forecast and used the older projections layered back into that. But given the growth in these emerging technologies, stakeholders and staff both agreed that we should update these as well. So this go around will not only update the self-generation forecast that Sudhakar will talk about a little bit later today, but we're also going to be updating our electric vehicle forecast. Next slide, please. And so I tried to break our process down into 3 steps, 3 easy steps for demand forecasting. Maybe not the easiest, but that's kind of how I look at it. It's easier to comprehend that way. And so the first basic step is really re-estimating those econometric models. We have one model for each major sector and planning area, so a little over 40 models or so. And this is really focused on consumption, which is the basis of our forecast. And I know sometimes the terminology gets different in the energy field, but for the demand analysis office, when we refer to consumption, it's not sales, it's actually consumption regardless of the generation source. And so knowing that there's quite a bit of self-generation in California, that's a simple way to say is that it's sales plus what we would assume individuals would be self-generating themselves. So it's going to be a little larger than a sales figure you may see in other places. Next slide. And so step 2 is essentially calculating and applying our forecast adjustment factors. So once we have re-estimated our models, we run the older set of drivers. In this case, what we used for CED19, all the economic and demographic drivers plus electricity rates. And then we take the other set of the newer vintage of data and run that through our re-estimated models as well. And so from here, we can measure the percentage difference between the 2 models. Essentially, we're measuring the effect of the changes to the economic drivers and the rates. And then we use this percentage difference as adjustment factors that we apply to our previous forecast, net of the adjustments that we make for energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and climate change. And so by doing this, we can account for the specific effects of changes to our drivers without having to run our full end use sector model forecast. Next slide, please. And the final step is basically finalizing all the results. So once we have our adjusted baseline forecasts, we can go ahead and add back the previously estimated committed efficiency estimates that we did in CED 2019. We apply our climate change adjustment to our mid and our high case. And then we add in the new electric vehicle forecast information. And so that'll create our new updated baseline forecast, consumption forecast specifically. And so to get to sales, we essentially subtract off the scenarios for self-generation to derive the sales forecast. And then the consumption forecast will be fed into our hourly model along with the demand modifiers, the EV, self-gen, storage, and a few other pieces. And that will create the new hourly projections once that's ran through those models, the hourly model once again. And then finally, we apply our AAE scenarios to our sales forecasts, and obviously that's included in our hourly forecast as well. And we have that full suite of managed forecasts that Nick mentioned earlier this morning. Just checking the Q&A just in case. You can move on to the next slide. And so here we have our demand scenarios, our economic and demographic drivers. And so I'll spend a little time here for sure. So for our demand scenarios, we essentially align them with scenarios that were developed by Moody's Analytics. For our baseline scenario, we're essentially using an expected case or a 50-50 probability case for our mid-energy demand. For the high energy demand, Moody's develops a custom high scenario for us. And then for the low energy demand, we're essentially looking at a prolonged lower growth. And so in the COVID context, what we're sort of expecting here, given these assumptions, is that we have a recovery in the economy that is very similar to a natural disaster rather than a full recession. And so in comparison to the Great Recession, you have a much quicker recovery. There's a rebound that occurs, a slight lag, and then you sort of return to normal growth. And so we have a much quicker recovery, in this case, by 2023, from assuming the recession starts beginning in 2020 with the massive unemployment that we saw. We'll start coming out of it by 2023. By comparison, if you look back to the Great Recession, some estimates say it took about 9 years to close the gap in terms of GDP, in terms of productivity. Just going back to that high scenario, I'll start there. Sort of the assumptions there is that the COVID-19 crisis is resolved much sooner. So you sort of have to think about the optimism around effective treatments and vaccines that essentially allow people to return to business as normal. Businesses start opening up, people go out to retail, go to the movies, start going back to normal life. And so that's what's going to be driving that particular scenario. The employment starts rebounding faster and the consumers start spending. On the flip side of that, the lower scenario, we're going to see similar near-term decline as with the base case and even somewhat with the high case. That's something that's really not escaping either of these scenarios. There is a decline in 2020. But in the low scenario, there is no rebound. And a few assumptions are driving that. The first assumption is really that sort of antithesis of what I explained for the high scenario. It's that consumers are reluctant to travel and spend in outdoor retail spaces, the brick and mortars. There's a lot of precautionary saving from that, basically anticipating things might get worse later in the year, or the economy goes down even further, and there's essentially slower growth, which keeps the wages low. And then the prospects of reliable treatments, which are probably driving all these three other points that I made earlier. The prospects of reliable treatments are seeming more distant. And so that's really what's going to be driving a lot of the changes in consumer behavior that we're assuming, or Moody's is assuming here. And also the other piece is that the federal stimulus essentially is not as effective in keeping the economy afloat, keeping it going. And then the mid scenario, as I said, is sort of a business as usual. There is actually not really a business as usual. I'd say there's a recession in there for sure, but we do have a recovery. And the risk of a second wave of COVID happening later this year is not in there as well. And a delay or failure in stimulus is not in that scenario as well. So it's so that's what the plans are basically for that mid case. And those assumptions are actually risks for all these scenarios. Obviously, we're not epidemiologists. I know there's some concern anecdotally about COVID, resurging once again later in the flu season potentially. I think Moody's recognizes that as well. They're economists, not epidemiologists, but they want to point out that those are big risks that are still difficult to account for. And then an additional piece to that is a delay or failure in any future stimulus among our scenarios that we have here. So that's touching on Moody's scenarios and the data we get from them. That's most of the economic drivers. The other bit of data that we get is from the Department of Finance, and those are our key drivers for households and population. And I'll talk about those a little bit today. And then our commercial floor space, which is the key driver for commercial electricity usage. And these forecasts for commercial floor space we develop these in-house, and we're using historical commercial permit data that's translated to estimates of historical floor space. And then we use different population and employment segments to develop forecasts of additional floor space that will be added in the future. Next slide, please. So here's our first population projection that we received from Department of Finance. You'll notice in this case, there's only a mid scenario. We only have one population estimate that we use. There's no high or low cases. But population in California, as many folks know, has been declining. The growth estimates since 2010 census have kind of reduced, new estimates of that growth from 2010 have reduced this trajectory here for population growth. And there's a few sort of components of change that are leading to this. So net migration, for example, has been cut in half. That was initially, net migration was somewhere around the range of 200,000 per year. And that's been cut in half to now about 100,000 people per year. There's also fewer births along with less foreign-born migrants. And then slowed life expectancy, which essentially leads to a higher death rate. I know it's kind of morbid, but the death rate is increasing. We're still outpacing most of the country, but life expectancy has gone down a little bit. And regarding those birth rates, just some quick stats there. Birth rates are essentially declining for women under 30 and rising for those above 30, which is kind of interesting. So especially at ages 35 to 40. But now our fertility rates are somewhat on par with Spain and Italy, which has had low fertility rates since the 1970s. But as you can see here in the graph, that annual growth rate is cut in half to about 5% or 0.5% annually from 2020 to 2030, and quite a bit less population by 2030, about 42 million is what we reached then, and it's a fairly sizable difference, about 1.2 million less than we had predicted, or DOF had predicted in 2019. And there's two little percentages on the bottom. I just wanted to point those out. So that black line down the middle is our historical starting point. And there's equal number of years both to the left and to the right of that. So that 8.4% is actually how much population we've added through 2019. And then how much population we would expect through 2030. So you can see there's quite a big percentage difference there, about 3% or so, on what the future looks for population. Next slide, please. And here we have the other Department of Finance input we get. In this case, we do have both a mid and a high scenario. We don't have a low scenario here. And the high scenario is developed by DAO staff, essentially using some of the short-term growth expectations and carrying those forward. Just to make a slightly more optimistic scenario for our demand cases. So household projections are basically a function of those population estimates I showed. So you would expect similar declines. You're essentially taking your population projection and you're looking at your different age cohorts. And so depending on those cohorts, you would be measuring headship rates, or how many heads of household will be formed through that. And so you would expect similar results as you readjust your household projection with new population estimates. But you can do see a minor uptick there through 2021. And that's like a near-term adjustment, taking into account more recent data on permits and things like that. And so you'll have a slight rise there, but eventually it reverts back to the typical projection that you would normally use there. But nonetheless, we are a little bit lower. Still had more households in 2019 than we previously expected. And a minor decrease in growth, 0.9%. The previous estimates annually were about a little over 1%. But here we reach about 14 million households, but it's still, about 140,000 less overall. And there's going to be some differences across the state. This household projection can be somewhat misleading. I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of this presentation, but we do see slightly more household growth in the northern part of California versus the southern part, except for San Diego. San Diego seems to be the exception. They do have some near-term growth in households that I'll talk about later today. Next slide, please. And these are our income, personal income growth here. And in this case, it's per capita personal income. Obviously, there's a nice dip in there. That actually happens in 2021. And so the reason for that is 2020, when you think of personal income, how it's measured, that includes things like unemployment benefits and payments, government payments. And so 2020 is essentially still held up there, given that there were some stimulus and unemployment benefits that were given out. But the expectation is that the employment gets so rampant that you end up having and the economy starts slowing down, that by 2021, you indeed have a decline in personal income. And so the growth here, that 2.7% decline is not in 2020, obviously, that's in 2021. But the growth actually ends up being just a tad above what we previously expected in terms of growth rates. And that's mostly because you could see as we come out of 2021, there is sort of a resurgence that occurs and a higher growth rate that occurs as you recover in the economy that leads to a slightly higher long-term growth rate. Next slide. And here's the big one. This is probably not coming as a shock to most people. So really large increase in commercial employment that we see in the data so far. This is something on par with an average annual unemployment rate of about 9 to 10% statewide. Obviously, there's different quarters that came much higher. I think I saw reports as high as 14, 15% in certain quarters of 2020. But that unemployment somewhat remains even in our mid case and somewhat in our high case through 2021. And then we start seeing that recovery. So as I mentioned it earlier, you have this, in terms of employment, you sort of have this recovery that's similar to a natural disaster, where there's a big sharp drop that you would see, things start recovering. And then as you get a little bit out towards, let's say, 2023, there's a slight lag as things start slowing down a little bit, and then you sort of revert back to a normal growth trend that's largely as similar to what we saw prior to in our previous forecast, save for the giant dip that we have here. So overall, slightly better long-term growth, or sorry, lower long-term growth, but ultimately we were about 2% below our previous mid case. So there are a few reasons for that. Possibilities around there. So you could have regarding why the employment levels don't quite reach what we had before. Regarding that, you could have less retail bankruptcies, boosts in productivity that essentially keep the employment from getting back to those previous levels. But that's something that's still trying to get, we want to talk to Moody's a little bit more about to fully understand that. But that seems to be what the result is there. Next slide, please. And here we have commercial floor space projections for the states. So we do this forecast, it's by building type. And these are our functions of employment and population subsectors that I mentioned before. with a few various economic drivers such as personal income or GDP, depending on the building type. So in our previous forecast, we expected about 142 million additional square feet of floor space in that period from 2020 through 2023. And that essentially has been cut in more than half. So that 142 million is down to about 60 million. And then that growth rate is also cut in half. So really not a lot of growth in that near term. It's almost nearly flat once you get into 2021 and 2022. And then as commercial employment starts picking up again, since that's one of the larger drivers for the floor space, you start seeing the floor space projections tick up and back up again. But ultimately, we're still quite a bit lower than what we previously expected in that CED 19 mid case. And the growth rate overall actually declines somewhat. On an annual basis, it's about 0.5%, as you see there. And then CED 2019 is a little closer to 0.8%, maybe just a tad under, between like 0.8 and 0.9%. So things have slowed down quite a bit in that space. Go to my next slide. And so here is manufacturing unemployment. This is basically continuing the trend that we have seen for probably the better part of a decade. Manufacturing in California has been declining quite a while. Compared to our previous forecasts, you know, we already were, obviously we could see that we're already predicting a decline in employment in this sector. But the impact of the COVID-19 decreased that employment level by about 4% than what we previously predicted for 2020, or 4 times as many. There's some bounce back in 2023, but ultimately we're still expecting this sector to decline, and it does have impacts on our manufacturing and industrial energy usage. I'll stop here for a moment. I saw there was a question back on population estimates. I think I can probably touch on that a little bit later. I don't know if I have the time to break out those specifics, but let's go to our next slide. Actually, apologies. I will go back to a question there. I'll probably answer it verbally here. The question was breaking out the population estimates by 3 main factors: lower life expectancy, lower birth rate, and lower net migration. I can share the estimates from the Department of Finance, share a link later, and that'll have that information where you get the different factors that I mentioned: the lower life expectancy, birth rate, and net migration. Okay, sorry about that. So
hey,
given
Carrie,
the information, yeah.
Carrie,
ahead,
it's Matt. There's just one more question here for you from Bob Emmerich. Do you have the graphs for the economic scenarios?
Can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, I was showing some graphs of various, is he referring to specific like energy scenarios?
Okay, I'll follow up with him and we'll come back to it.
Okay. Yeah, and I maybe, if he's referring to energy, I have a few caveats here, and you'll see in my next slide, I do have some specific scenario breakouts, but there's a reason why I'm not calling out specific numbers here, and I'm going to talk about that right now. So given this information that we have on the changing economy, we thought it was reasonable to run this information through our update process. It's going to be limited in that we don't have the new electric vehicle forecast, and we don't have new PV estimates or self-generation estimates. So we really can't do a sales forecast. It didn't seem reasonable to do that. So what we attempted to do here is essentially account for all those economic changes and then leave in the previous assumptions around EVs as they were from the CED 2019 to adjust our consumption forecasts. And so the results I'm showing here, as I mentioned before, are obviously very preliminary and have this key caveat in that we're not accounting for changes to EVs, which we'll learn more about today. But we're going to continue to update this, and as we get further along in our process, we'll be able to share more detailed information on what we expect to occur in the new projections. So we can go to our next slide where I break out the scenarios on a statewide basis. And so ultimately consumption is going to be about 2% lower in 2019 than we previously expected. And so that 2% is pretty important here, particularly for my next slide. So I try to separate that 2% out from the other economic impacts here. The reason being, it seems somewhat misleading to say, for example, our forecasts decreased by 5% when 2% of that was actually the result of just the change in the starting point. So that's what some of these other numbers reflect here, and I'll point out if it reflects otherwise. Apologize if I'm making that overly complicated. So our new starting point is about 2% lower than we previously expected, but consumption through 23, if we account for just the economic changes, is a 2% reduction on average through 2023 and about 1% on average for the remaining years. Now, if you wanted to compare that directly to forecast, not accounting for that starting point, the new trend would be somewhere about 4 to 5% lower in that near term, and then 3 to 4% in the long term. So quite a big reduction. And obviously, I'm purposely not calling out the long-term number there in 2030 because of the major caveats here that I listed. We're not incorporating those EV assumptions, which could change this somewhat in comparison to CED 19. And on the next slide, wasn't able to pull any specific numbers or have any graphs. It was a little tight to kind of pull this together, but I was able to pull some numbers together for different sectors. And I have some additional comments for different planning areas. So obviously the take-home message here is that electricity consumption is going to be down compared to 2019, more than likely, even with potential changes to EVs. It remains to be seen, but more than likely we are going to see a reduction in electricity consumption in our new projections in comparison to what we previously projected. So through 2023, we can expect residential consumption, although it grows about 2% annually, which is a similar rate to what we had in 2019. It's still about 2% lower than what we previously expected in our forecast, which is similar to the total adjustment in our forecast. But if you include, this also included, as I mentioned, that 2% is really critical because actually across most of the sectors, there was a 2% drop in our starting point compared to what we previously expected. And that was mostly, it's a little bit difficult to actually tell. So I did some quick analysis last night, and it looked like for the most part, if you look at the annual weather statistics, so in terms of heating and cooling degree days, 2019 was relatively moderate for most of the state. PG&E in the Northern California may have been slightly above that normal if you compare it to a 30-year average of cooling and heating degree days. But if you recall our 2019 forecast, we did have somewhat of a decline in economic growth that was occurring around 2021. So it could be possible that 2019, the reason for that going down a little bit was in fact due to somewhat of a slowdown in economic activity. So once again, that 2% is going to be important here. Going back to this commercial reduction that I show. Just the economic impacts is about a 4% reduction in what commercial consumption would be for 2020. But if you take into account that differing starting point, that 2%, it's actually about a 6% reduction to what we previously projected. Annually, we see some recovery through 2024 for the commercial sector, growing fairly steady at 2%. But overall, it's just a pretty big decline in commercial consumption, especially in the near term. Industrial and mining, pretty big changes there as well. Manufacturing, as I showed earlier, is on the decline, and it took a big hit as well. Everything kind of shut down for that. There's a reduction of about 3% through 2022. Obviously, there's some recovery that I showed. Employment in that sector, which does drive some of the energy usage up a little bit, but ultimately this sector just continues to climb. Now for the differences across the regions, these are just some kind of broad points here. The northern regions are seeing slightly more growth, and that's due to those changes in households that I mentioned. NCNC really and PG&E see the smallest slowdowns in compared to the other regions, Edison, LAWP, and San Diego. The household projections there actually were up a little bit in comparison. So the starting point was a little bit higher, and then the growth rate wasn't as slowed down as some of the other regions. By comparison, Edison, Southern California Edison planning area and the LAWP planning area saw reductions in the total number of households that we had projected compared to the 2019 forecast. The exception being San Diego, which saw some more near-term growth. And looking at some of the permit data, that seems reasonable in that there was an uptick in permits in that, building permits in that region. In terms of commercial consumption, Southern California sees a somewhat larger impacts to the non-residential sectors, and this is going to be a differing in the mix of industry and employment in those regions. So Edison and San Diego, you know, compared to PG&E and NCNC, I should caveat that NCNC, we call that our Northern California non-CAISO region. And that is essentially the balancing authority of Northern California plus the Turlock Irrigation District. But the large driver there is in fact SMUD. We have yet to break the forecast down into that much detail yet. So that Northern California region, along with PG&E, you have different employment in those areas. So you have to think that high tech, if you were to compare that to Southern California, that's a little bit more of a Northern California thing to a certain degree. And then you also have a lot of government employment. And so you really didn't see, when you look at the data, high tech and employment and government employment had relatively little change in the employment figures in comparison to that commercial employment graph that I showed earlier. We had this massive decline. Tech and government employment did not see that at all. So if you compare that, the Northern California having tech, government employment compared to Southern California, there's a big difference there. There's not as much high-tech employment in the counties that comprise Edison's territory, and similar for San Diego. It's not as big. I mean, I think it's growing, but it's not as big as it is in Northern California. The only exception for Southern California in terms of that, that high-tech is actually LAWP, because it's in the city center. When you look at the high-tech employment, and particularly government employment as well, there's still a fair amount of that occurring in DWP's territory. So they're not as, if you were to compare DWP's commercial consumption, you would see that they're not as affected by the drop in commercial employment that Edison and San Diego were. So that seems to be a Southern California exception. With that, I can go to some of the next steps. So obviously, I try to caveat this several times. It's a preliminary analysis. I was a little reluctant to show actual numbers here, so I definitely wanted to refer to percentages. Folks get a sense of that, and we still have quite a bit to finalize. But once we do get more finalized consumption and sales forecast, we'll definitely share this through our DOG working group. That'll be sometime in November ahead of our January adoption, which we are still planning for in 2021. And there'll likely be a December workshop in between there where we can present more formally the full forecast results. Looks like I have 5 minutes, but court reporter asked me to clarify the spelling of NCNC, so I'll answer that question. So NCNC is going to be Northern California, non-California ISO. And that will include, just to clarify for other folks as well, that includes the Balancing Authority of Northern California, which includes SMUD service territory and the Turlock Irrigation District. All right. I can't recall this, if we're taking questions or,
Oh,
or
sure.
comments from the commissioners.
This is Heather Rate. So thanks, Carrie. And so commissioners, if you had any questions, we can go ahead and take them.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. Good presentation. I really appreciate the comparisons with last year and kind of the nuance on what's changed. I guess I did have a couple of questions on that. So, you talked about sort of the migration and made some comparisons between, population growth generally and comparisons between Northern and Southern California and sort of San Diego being a little bit different. Do you have good, so I think a trend that we seem to be seeing is sort of intrastate migration as COVID impacts, where within the state people choose to live. And I guess, are you picking up any of that? I mean, amenities of cities are kind of changing, and there seems to be a little bit of scrambling going on in terms of where people choose to, or sort of projecting that they're going to want to put down their roots from here on out. I guess, are you picking up any of that, or is Moody's picking up any of that in their, or finance in their demographic work?
Yeah, so for the demographics, as I mentioned, that's mainly going to be the Department of Finance. It's primarily the Department of Finance population household estimates. And they had a key caveat in there. It was from June, but the key caveat there was it does not take into account COVID-19. The reason being, obviously, that's a huge, it needs to be studied. Similar to the recession, you have this huge blip in there. And then the question is that an anomaly, or does that, have some kind of underlying trend that needs to be accounted for in the future? And so the documentation that DOF had there is that they do want to go back and have to recalibrate their models to understand, what is going to happen in the state in terms of migration, population movement. But yeah, those are good points, keeping an eye on where folks are moving.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's just a lot of anecdotal kind of discussion about that, but I guess I'm wondering how real that is. So it'll be interesting to see what finance turns up.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add a little bit to that. So historically, we have seen that, given for a number of reasons, I think the housing costs and, this sort of move to the suburbs that has kind of happened, particularly in Southern California is where I recall it happening the most, where folks are moving from the coastal regions towards inland, riverside. Housing's a little cheaper, less dense and things like that. But you're right, with COVID-19, maybe that surges even more if folks are worried about urban areas. So spread of, let's say there's a lack of a vaccine, people are worried about catching a disease of some kind. They may want to continue to go into more suburban areas just to avoid.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and then, if there's less demand, if the demand profiles in different places start to look different, then housing prices equilibrate differently. So I think that's a complex thing. So it'll be interesting to see what they can turn up. And then, so just two other quick questions, I think. I think they're quick. So you sort of talked about this, but I guess, and maybe the update isn't the place where we really dig into this, but the sector shift between commercial and residential, are you sort of, you sort of talked about that independently, but as commercial goes down and sort of more economic activity happens and is reflected in the residential sector, how much of that are you going to be able to do this year versus, really looking at it in 2021 with the full update?
Yeah. That's going to be, I was trying to caveat that in the beginning. That's going to be quite difficult with this type of update. So really the take home on that is that we were able to, the economic changes in the long term can account for that. The typical changes you would expect, but the residential sector projections here aren't really taking into account any structural changes in the shift in residential. It's essentially looking at, your basics, like number of households, what's that's growing at. What does the income look like, household income, and then what are employment rates looking like? And so those are really the key drivers for that. So it's a little difficult to model that shift, like you're saying, from commercial, all that commercial usage runs over to the residential sector. Now, all that being said, we can go back and get that 2020 data as it comes in right now for September. And we can sort of use that to kind of account for that fact that residential usage is going to be down, going to be up potentially, if that's what the data shows. We do see this uptick in there that can kind of confirm that. And then we can kind of think about that a little bit more. We asked for quite a bit of help from stakeholders as well on how they may be approaching it, because it because in one sense, you could really take that into account and say, yeah, we know people are going to start being from home, or working from home, and we're going to keep that going in the future. But does that stop? Do people go back? You know, once things open up, are people like, you know, ready to get out of their house and go back to work?
Yeah.
Or are people more timid about it? So those are a lot of difficult
I think
questions.
probably, you know, there's probably an independent discussion that we need to have in the full forecast next year, I would imagine, about the, you know, how big the error bands are on some of the work that we're doing. Because, you know, it's hard to predict behavior. So we're going to have to, you know, really lean on Moody's and Finance and others to kind of appreciate that. I guess the other point I'd make here is that we're going to be doing an increasingly deeper dive on the demand side stuff, on the localized resources, on, you know, we saw with the outages, you know, demand response kind of needs a rethink, load flexibility. We're doing a bunch of stuff with the Energy Commission to enable those tools. And you know, our fundamental resource is the load shapes for the for residential, you know, we need to really have a good idea of the load shapes, and yet things are changing, behavior is changing. And so the keeping our eye on that and understanding the uncertainties and behavioral issues, I think is going to be increasingly important. So just you know, flagging that for next year, really. I mean, not for this update. And then just a concrete question about the census. What year do we expect the census? You know, it's wrapping up now, you know, the next few months. A lot of processing to be done. Is that a 2022? Is there any information for 2021? You know, because right now we're kind of operating on the finance econ, you know, demographics, but the census really will help calibrate that to reality. So what's the process? What's the timeline for that? Is my question.
I definitely don't believe it's 2021. I think that takes quite a while to process, but I'd have to get back to you. We have our econ demo staff person.
Yeah, that's fine. It's always nice to have that stake in the ground with the actual.
She just messaged me right now. So 2022, there'll be some preliminary data.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's a nice like calibration, you know, waypoint to put in the ground when we have the actual.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, great. Thanks. I don't have any other questions. I invite my colleagues.
Carrie, this is Janaea. That was an excellent detailed presentation as always. Just a quick question, or maybe it's really a follow-on to the discussion you and Commissioner McAllister just had about the residential versus the commercial. And I do think it'll be interesting for us to be able to tease some of that out because, you know, as you've already noted, people are working from home, they're doing school from home, and I wonder if what that looks like when you tease out residential and commercial. Does it turn into kind of like a 1-for-1, or is it like a little bit less than a little bit smaller of an increase in residential consumption, but it's a big decrease in commercial? It's just to be very interesting to see what those trends end up looking like.
Yeah, it's definitely just kind of off the cuff, and maybe I didn't clarify as well, but the big dip seems to be in the commercial and industrial sectors. That's just that huge decline, and you know, there was nothing to really get away from, you know, massive amounts of people just not working. I mean, that just happened. The question I feel like is, you know, what effect did that have on the residential side? I feel like that's where most of the uncertainty lies. And then the other uncertainty is, how do we recover in the future? Do some of these I know some folks are tracking bankruptcies and things. Anecdotally, I've heard, you know, that starts coming into question. Do businesses even come back? Some of these brick and mortars, you know, kind of like spitballing here to a certain degree, but, you know, we've heard anecdotally Amazon has picked up a lot of slack that typical retail would generally do. And some of these retail places are big, like a JCPenney's or something like that, takes up a large amount of space in a mall, and if that suddenly disappears, what fills that void? So those are other questions as well.
Yeah, and looking at what does that look like on the transportation sector side as well, right? Definitely. If everyone's getting everything by delivery versus going to stores here and there. So yeah, lots of questions for us to look into for sure. Thanks.
So
that's
Carrie,
all I have.
I have maybe just a comment and then a question. And my comment builds on what Commissioner McAllister was asking about demographics. So I know it's not your wheelhouse, but you know, as we evaluate the impacts of COVID and what that will be in the long term, in terms of demographics. I think there's also this question about wildfires and how confident people feel living in certain areas of the state that are more prone to wildfires. And I think that's also this room for a lot of analysis around how demographics are going to shift in response to these major crises that the state is navigating. So just be curious to see in years upcoming what the impact of wildfires and people, trying to be more conscious of the fact that as we move into certain areas of the state, we become more vulnerable to the impacts of wildfires. So that's my comment. My question actually has to do with areas where we're seeing growth in electricity usage, and you mentioned high tech as an area where we're still very robust. And I'm curious in particular about data centers. Have we done any analysis specific to data centers and whether there is a large amount of growth? I mean, we're seeing here, of course, at the Commission, requests for backup generation at data centers, and I'm just curious about the trends more broadly across the state on data center electricity usage.
Yeah, so I haven't dug into specifics on data centers for this analysis. And in fact, this preliminary analysis that I put together here was done on a larger planning area level. So it's really focused on just the economic drivers at the planning area level, but that is definitely something we can look into for sure. I recall in the past that we have made adjustments specifically for data centers, I believe in Silicon Valley Power area, which I think is where some of it was occurring. But that's ready to be revisited. We have made that adjustment, and my predecessor, Chris Kowalik, developed that, so we can rehash that up. And that sounds reasonable to do an analysis and definitely find out if that's a growing trend in the state or in where particularly it's happening. One quick comment though on your comment about the wildfires. So we do see some of that in our data demographically. So I'm recalling last year around 2019 in that forecast, we have our forecasting zone nomenclature. So forecasting zone 3, which is a little bit above Northern California. And there was a massive drop in like households, and we were like, what the heck is going on? I think there's something wrong with the data. And it didn't dawn on us, there was a campfire that occurred, and there was a large portion of households that just went away. And so you have these anomalies in the data, but that's something we can definitely start keeping track of as we get more history and potentially these wildfires become more of a norm. Unfortunately, they could be. And then it will have, as both you and Commissioner McAllister were referring to, starts having effects on, the demographics in our state, where households form, where population goes. So it's definitely something, those are important comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to comment on the data center piece. So one, I'd kind of point at, well, not point, that would be rude, but on to Commissioner Scott, Vice Chair Scott, because we've done so much good research over the years on data center efficiency, and there have been really great efforts to promulgate new technologies that do kind of try to manage that absolutely increasing load. Because they do have a heavy cooling load because they generate a lot of internal heat, and so getting rid of that heat is a big deal. And so I think on not only in the core forecast, as Commissioner Monahan indicated, but also on the AAEE, there's quite a bit of potential for energy efficiency in that growing sector, and it is a large, it's a significant wedge, like you can see it in the overall demand forecast, the consumption of data centers. So that's certainly a modern economy issue that we have to keep looking at.
Well, and then I just have one more comment, and then I'm all done, which actually doesn't relate to our projections for electricity use, but more our projections when the power goes down, and how we're seeing more and more backup generation, mostly powered by diesel, but not solely powered by diesel. And I think that's an area I know Vice Chair Scott, Commissioner McAllister, I think all the commissioners are interested in this topic of how do we account for backup generation, and what's our role in helping make sure that the state can continue to make progress on clean air and climate, even as we use backup generation to support critical services when the electricity is down. So it's an area I think not for this year, but for future years around thinking about backup generation and doing a better job accounting for it, understanding it, and making investments to help mitigate any harmful impacts to air quality or our clean energy goals.
I'd point out next week on, I believe it's on Thursday. Let me just make sure, I don't want to get this wrong. We're having a tri-agency, that's ISO, PUC, and Energy Commission workshop, Thursday on, it's specific to RA, so it's not exactly this conversation that we're having, but it's looking at RA and kind of sussing out the issue of getting RA credit for behind the meter hybrid exports. So that's one place where this conversation that your points are really well taken. I mean, we saw in the outage last Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we saw that offloading load onto backup generation, whatever the source, whether it's ships getting unplugged from shore power or data centers going onto their backup diesels or whatever backup generation they have. I mean, that freed up a lot of load that kept the lights on, really helped keep the lights on. And so having a an intentional strategy and plan for what happens under scenarios X, Y, Z, I think is really important just from a reliability perspective, right? And so obviously it's got energy forecasting implications as well, but I think that reliability piece is obviously kind of job one for the joint agencies and as we go forward for planning purposes. So lots of overlapping themes these days.
Mm-hmm. Just one more data point for this conversation. Yesterday, the Public Utilities Commission hosted a workshop that included the Energy Commission and also the Air Resources Board to talk about alternatives to diesel for backup generation and for the public safety power shutoffs. So this conversation is taking place, I think, in multiple forum across our state agencies because we're all thinking about it.
Okay, great. This is Heather. If I may suggest we keep moving, this is all such good stuff, but we got a lot of material. So we have Matt Caldwell from the Energy Assessments Division who is helping us moderate the Q&A from attendees. So Matt, I think we covered some questions. If you could just go ahead and read out one question for Carrie, that would be helpful.
Yeah, no problem. So Carrie, it's a question from Andy Brown. And the question is there a reliable source for commercial building occupancy / vacancy data?
Yeah, so we do maintain historical data on vacancies and occupancy that we use in our commercial end use models. I can't recall the precise data source for that off the top of my head right now, but we do have a database of that. Perhaps if Andy wants to, my email is on there. If Andy wants to share his information with me via email, I can dig around on that. We can follow up on that information. Now, caveat this, I assume the intent is also to, there might be some forecasted data and that might be a little tough to come by. I'm sure there's various assumptions around that. Yeah, so I could follow up with Andy if he wants to reach out and we can discuss that.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Heather, do we have time for one more?
I think we're actually falling behind. I think we should just keep moving if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, super. Thank you so much, Carrie. That was really great. I'll introduce our next speaker, Lynn Marshall. Lynn is the lead for resource adequacy demand forecasting. She also develops electricity rate forecasts for the Energy Commission's Energy Assessments Division, which she will be discussing today. Go ahead, Lynn. Thank you.
Okay, the electricity rate scenarios I'm presenting are inputs into our various demand forecasts, including the models Carrie was discussing and also the self-generation and transportation demand forecasting models. Next slide, please. So to briefly describe the way we design the scenarios for the rates, we have the mid-case demand, of course, and our mid-case procurement costs including NAM gas hub prices, GHG allowance prices. That goes through our Plexos model. And other non-procurement revenue requirements are based on expected outcomes of pending applications and current trends in costs and policy drivers. Then in the high demand case, we're assuming lower procurement costs, lower growth in distribution revenue requirements, and combine that with the high demand, that produces a lower rate forecast. So conversely, in the low demand case, we have higher procurement costs, more investment in distribution infrastructure, decarbonization, et cetera. And combined with the lower demand forecast, that means that the fixed cost per kilowatt hour of sales are higher. So next slide. Okay, so the changes made for the 2020 update. First, updating historic data for 2018 and 2019, which there were the EIA data was not available for 2018, and developed estimates of 2020 rates using the IOU advice letters and recent rate actions by public utilities. Also incorporated new information on rate plans for some of the publicly owned utilities. And for the IOU revenue requirement projections, and using the CPUC's utility cost and rate tracking tool. So the CPUC is now getting quarterly reports from the IOUs that itemize all of the revenue requirements authorized in current rates, all of the pending applications, and itemization of any expected applications in the next year or two or three. So this provides a really helpful comprehensive view of likely revenue requirements over the next few years. So for example, PG&E had around, I think, 13 different pending applications. So this was a big help to staff, and we'll look forward to making use of this more in the future. So for years following the current general rate case proceeding, we're escalating the distribution, and that's broadly defined. Distribution revenue requirements include, the base GRC, but also transportation, infrastructure, SGIP, and now a lot of wildfire safety mitigation spending. So I'm escalating the mid case at 4.5% annually, and the high and the low 0.5% lower and higher, respectively. So these assumptions are 0.5% higher than what was used for the 2019 IEPR. And that is because they're now including costs identified via the wildfire mitigation plans. And, we're also seeing more proposed costs for grid modernization, transportation, infrastructure. Now there's microgrids in there. So this looks like more reasonable assumptions. And then finally, we incorporated new wholesale electricity prices from our final 2019 IEPR Plexos results. So slide 4. Okay, so going back to the updating the historic rates, this is kind of a snapshot of recent rates in each of the planning areas. So these are the weighted average of all of the utilities in each planning area. The LADWP and SMUD, which is a large part of the NCNC category, those were expected based on their past and current rate plans. So I didn't make any significant changes to those forecasts for this update. We'll expect LADWP to be initiating a new rate case later this year, so we'll do a bigger revise next year. PG&E, that reflects both a lot of GRC attrition, but there's also a lot of catastrophic event recovery, wildfire costs. and their transmission rates have been increasing. Similarly, SDG&E, that's primarily growth in their general rate case revenues. Slide 5. Slide 5. So this shows the commercial sector rates, similar trends, PG&E growth rate for commercial, rate increases for commercials a little lower. One comment about SCE, so there were some decreases there reflecting rate costs being refunded to customers, the songs settlement, there were some tax savings, and now those are amortized. And then in 2020, there was a pretty significant increase via the GRC attrition, and that is a lot of wildfire mitigation expenditures. So slide 6. Okay, this illustrates the effects of the distribution rate scenarios. So the black bar are current residential distribution rates, and the other bars show how they increase as of 2030 in the different scenarios. So in the high demand case, the real rates increase only a little over 1% annually in Edison and San Diego, and they're essentially flat in PG&E. On the other hand, in that low demand case where we've increased a lot, made a lot of distribution infrastructure investment, but demand doesn't increase, then we have, those are like 3 to 4% increases in PG&E and Edison. Okay, slide 7. All right, and these are wholesale price produced by our Plexos production cost modeling team. And so this incorporated the final 2019 IEPR demand forecast, final burner tip gas prices, and also the final carbon GHG allowance prices. So overall, because of primarily lower gas price projections, it's somewhat lower than in the previous forecast. However, it's still increasing at more than 3% annually, notably after the 2024 period, as we have generation resources retiring, and that's driving up market prices. Okay, so next slide, slide 8. All right, so here's the forecast for the PG&E planning area residential sector. You see in the near term, some large increases as we get both this reflects the current GRC settlement and wildfire and catastrophic event cost recovery and wildfire mitigation costs. There's some additional wildfire insurance expenses that are pending applications for, and some of those costs get amortized, and so the growth rate levels off a bit, but it's still increasing a little at a faster rate than in the previous forecast. So next slide, slide 9, please. Okay, commercial sector, very similar trend. So you see here the effects of updating, getting more accurate data for the historic years. So this commercial rate is not just, it's PG&E bundled customers, but also has to account for the average rate of direct access and CCAs and publicly utilities. So I think we've got a more accurate starting point here with the newer data. I have not shown graphs for the industrial sector. It's a similar trend, but with a slightly lower growth rate, as industrial customers generally have a lower industrial distribution rate as a percentage of their total rate. So the industrial rates are increasing at 1.6% versus 2% for commercial sector. Okay, slide 10. Okay, and Heather's warning me about time, so I'll try to go quickly through the rest of the slides. Edison, we've incorporated Public Advocate's Office as recommendations on their general rate case. And then they do have quite a bit of wildfire cost recovery, and wildfire management plan expenditures. However, I had high GRC assumptions in the previous forecast, so it's a similar growth rate. And slide 11, please. Similar pattern with the commercial sector and noting the lower growth rate for the industrial. Okay, and let's go to San Diego, slide 12. Okay, in the last forecast, I clearly overestimated how much GRC revenues would be authorized. So I think the CPUC tracking tool will be very helpful to avoid that kind of error in the future. A little bit lower forecasted growth rate than previously. This includes 4% annual increases in the near term. And while they will be requesting wildfire mitigation expenses, it's expected percentage-wise to have less of an impact on rates than for PG&E and SCE. Okay, and slide 13. All right, and here again, we've got a more accurate starting point from incorporating, recalculating the 2018 and 19 data. And a slightly lower growth rate for the commercial sector. Okay, slide 14. Okay, so the transportation models use a statewide average rate. So that is the sales weighted average of all of our different planning areas. So interestingly, for the residential sector, the forecast ends up with a very similar endpoint actually. So some of those historic data errors are washing out. So note in the high demand case, the rates are increasing only slightly faster than in inflation, but in this low demand case where we have more grid investment, to support our resiliency and decarbonization goals, that produces 2.5% real rate increases over the forecast period. And slide 15. Commercial sector, a similar story. The final growth rate's actually very similar to the previous forecast. And the one on slide 16, industrial sector. Next slide, please. Okay. Actually have higher average rates and a somewhat lower growth rate than assumed in the previous forecast. So that'll get characterized in our transportation forecasting models. And that is all. So I'll open it up to questions.
So I don't have any specific questions. I just want to say thanks for that, Lynn. Good stuff. And yeah, we're headed in. So in the IEPR next year, between the full forecast and discussions about decarbonization on the natural gas side and also on the buildings, and as we sort of dig into some of these structural issues for the longer term, together with the PUC and bringing in the ISO and ARB, obviously that's a broad landscape of topics. But I think one of the pieces of this that our policy makers in the legislature and many others are going to be looking at is the rate issue. And so I really appreciate your thoughtfulness as we go into that time, because it's we're going to get some difficult questions. These are difficult issues, and the rate trends, particularly in the big IOUs, are going to be right front and center in terms of people's concerns. And as we talk about how equity is central to all we do in the policy world, that puts an even finer point on it. So I think really appreciate your well of expertise and knowledge on this. Not to put you on the spot, we'll try to avoid that, but but it's really good to be an informed voice in that room to help people understand where we might be going. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
No questions here. Thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, no questions here. I'm just glad to see the updates. You know, I think this is an area where we need to stay current, and certainly it's sobering to see the cost of the wildfire issue and some of the other challenges that we've had across the state that, of course, we know are going to require real investment to deal with.
And thanks for the presentation. I'm wondering, kind of building off what Commissioner McAllister said around equity, do we track disconnections? Do we have information on sort of impacts to consumers sort of, you know, most vulnerable to disconnection?
You know, the CPUC is doing that, and they have been in particular. Well, of course, COVID. I think they've discontinued disconnections, but they are paying attention to that. So, for example, as they're defaulting customers to time of use rates, they're tracking whether that might cause a higher rate of disconnections. So that's definitely in their, I think, in their affordability OIR paying attention to.
Thank you.
All right, commissioners, this is Heather. If there's no more questions, we could take a couple from Matt reading from the Zoom Q&A.
Great, please.
All right. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Lynn. First question is from B. Gustafson. He wants, or they want to know, did you say the projections for electricity rates include both CCAs and direct access rates? And if so, where do you get those rates?
Yes, so for historic data, so yes, they do include ESPs and CCAs. So the EIA data reports, each CCA is included in that data and reports their revenue requirements and sales. So that tells me the procurement rate that CCA customers are paying. And then I know the average distribution rate all customers are paying via the IOU data. And ESPs actually report at the statewide level and EIA Form 861. So that tells me for each individual ESP that average procurement rate to their customers statewide. So I use those to calculate IOU service area weighted average rates.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. So we have one more question from Jan Greiger. What do you assume about TOU periods and rate differentials, parentheses, to get hourly load forecast, or is that in a different module?
Well, it is in a different module, but I do that part too, so I can tell you. So this forecast is just an all-in annual average rate, but for our hourly forecast, we do have an adjustment for the time of use default transition. And for that, this last forecast, I used the hourly shapes from the load impact studies that were done, the pilot studies, and used those combined with the forecasted transition, number of accounts transitioning to construct an hourly load modifier that's incorporated in our forecast.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Heather, those are all the questions that we have.
Super, thank you so much, Lynn. That was really great. Okay. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Sudhakar Kannala. And Sudhakar is also from the Energy Commission, the Energy Assessments Division. He's a subject matter expert on self-generation. Sudhakar models the adoption and operation of behind-the-meter resources, most notably photovoltaic and battery storage systems. Go ahead, Sudhakar.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sudhakar Kannala, and I work on the self-generation forecast here at the Energy Commission. The focus of my presentation today is the behind-the-meter PV forecast, which represents the largest portion of self-generation in California. Specifically, I will discuss the updates we're making to the behind-the-meter PV forecast for the 2020 IEPR. Next slide, please. Before I get into the heart of the presentation, I want to briefly go over what's new and what's staying the same in the 2020 PV forecast. In terms of what's new, we've revised the historical PV installation data that informs the PV forecast. We've also revised PV capacity factors used in estimating PV generation. I will discuss both of these items in more detail in later slides. We will, of course, be updating inputs to the PV forecast that we normally do. This includes items such as electricity rates, building stock forecasts, PV costs, and so forth, a lot of which Carrie Garcia has already covered earlier today. In terms of what's going to stay the same, we don't plan on making any major methodological changes in forecasting PV adoption for the 2020 forecast. However, please note that revising capacity factors will impact the forecasted electricity generation from PV. Next slide, please. Before I start to talk about some of the changes we made, I just want to go over an important step in the forecasting process. The first step of forecasting involves processing historical data on behind-the-meter distributed generation systems, which involves behind-the-meter PV as well. The goal is to have a final data set which maps every distributed generation system in California with the following information. We want to know technology type, system size, installed cost and rebate data when available, sector and subsector information when available, the electric utility where the system is located, the utility planning area and forecast zone, where the forecast zone is defined by the Energy Commission's Demand Analysis Office, the county the system is installed, and the date in which it's installed. Of course, oftentimes we cannot find all of the data for each of these systems, but we try to do the best we can. Next slide, please. In the past, we've used a combination of interconnection and incentive program datasets to collect PV installation data. On this slide, I'm showing an image from last year's Demand Analysis Working Group meeting, describing the different datasets that have been used to collect PV installation data. Historical installation data, once added to our database, would stay in the database, and each year we would add new installation information for that current year. For the 2020 forecast, we did something different. For the past 2 years, under the Energy Commission's data collection rulemaking ability, we have been receiving interconnection data directly from the state's utilities. For the 2020 forecast, we've updated the entire historical PV installation data set using this interconnection data received from the utilities. This means that for the most part, all of our historical PV installation data now comes from the data we receive directly from the utilities, instead of the piecemeal approach that we've relied on before. The only times where we don't use the utility information is if utility submissions are missing. Finally, I want to note that most of the data that we receive from the utilities is confidential, so we can't make it public. However, similar data is already available publicly. For example, for PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric, PV interconnection data is available on the California DG Stats website. This data is very similar, if not exactly the same, from the data that we receive directly from the utilities. For POUs and smaller IOUs, the EIA publishes a data set called the Net Metering Dataset via its Form EIA-861, which also has interconnection data. Next slide, please. So why did we transition primarily to using the Energy Commission's interconnection data? Well, there are several advantages to using this data. The data allows us, first of all, to verify the accuracy of some of the information, though not all of the information, that we get. We could not do this before. Second, the data allows us to classify PV systems so that they align with the Energy Commission's customer sector and subsectors. Previously, relied on whatever sector classification that the underlying data used. this approach didn't always align PV systems with the Energy Commission's customer sectors. The data also didn't provide subsector information, which is sometimes needed by the Energy Commission sector modelers to their modeling work. Finally, we also believe that the historical data now is more accurate than it was before. However, there are some disadvantages as well to using this data that we get directly from the utilities. First, it places the burden of verifying the accuracy of the data and cleaning and curating the interconnection data on staff. For some of the other publicly available data sets, we would leverage the work done by others. For example, the California DGSTAT's website states that they perform hundreds of data integrity checks on them interconnection data. Now, a lot of that work falls on us. Second, classifying systems by sector and subsector takes significant amounts of time and effort. And it's not clear if we have time, if we have the time required to do this work during a full IEPR forecast. Third, the information we receive from utilities does not contain all of the information that we need, such as system orientation data, installed cost data, or incentive data. For this information, staff will continue to rely on publicly available data sets. Finally, by switching to the new data, historical data will not be harmonious with previous years. There will definitely be some discontinuity from previous historical data due to revisions. Next slide, please. So I just want to go over some of the results once we got the data from the utilities. So first, for the 2020 forecast, the sector of many PV installations were reclassified. And there was a significant increase in the number of systems assigned to subsectors. Here's a chart showing the sector and subsector information for behind-the-meter PV systems in the non-residential sectors for the last forecast and for this forecast. Now, keep in mind, this is only historical information. As you can see, there are a lot of changes. For example, there are more commercial systems and fewer industrial systems as we do the reclassification. Furthermore, if you look at the commercial sector, which is the blue colored part of the pie charts, in 2019, only a small percentage of systems were assigned a subsector, while a lot of them were not classified into a subsector. For this year, the vast majority of commercial systems were assigned a subsector, and a small minority weren't. In fact, any system within the state of California, which was 300 kilowatts or larger, was assigned a subsector for non-residential systems. Next slide, please. So given that we overhauled the historical data, I just wanted to present a chart that shows total installed capacity within the state by year. This chart shows that at the end of 2019, there was more than 9,400 megawatts of installed capacity. Next slide, please. Furthermore, for the last 4 years, from 2016 to 2019, about 1,300 to 1,400 megawatts was installed annually within the state. This chart shows that the PV market has been maturing. It also has a breakdown of installations each year by residential, commercial, and other sectors. Next slide, please. Finally, I have a chart showing the installed PV capacity by utility for the 20 largest utilities in the state in terms of PV capacity. So this is just for reference purposes. I don't have anything else to say on this, anything further to say on this. Next slide, please. Having talked about the historical PV data sets, I'm now going to move on to the other major change we've made for the 2020 forecast, and that's updating PV capacity factors by incorporating PV system orientation data. Next slide, please. So prior to this year's forecast, we made a simplifying assumption about all PV systems within this state. That is, we assumed that all PV systems were oriented southwards and they were tilted. Staff then selected a capacity factor for a south-facing system that was tilted and applied this capacity factor for all PV within the state. For the 2020 forecast, staff recalculated capacity factors based on system orientation. The capacity factors were weighted using the orientation data. Let me explain on the next few slides how this worked. Next slide, please. So starting in 2015, the California DG-Stats website started posting system orientation data for the vast majority of systems within the state. Before then, utilities really did not collect orientation data for most systems. So as you can see, I have a table on the right side of the slide, which shows the percentage of systems that had orientation data by year and by IOU. Now, the data set only has data for IOUs, and that's the only data we have. We do not have any similar data for POUs. But we assumed that POUs orientation data is similar to IOUs in nearby regions. And that's the assumption we're going to use going forward for the forecast. The IOU PV capacity and system orientation data is publicly available on the California DG-Stats website. So anybody in the public can download this data, do an analysis, and get the same information that I'm showing on this slide. So for the 2020 forecast, we incorporated this PV system orientation data into the historical PV generation estimates, and it would also be incorporated into the forecast estimates. Next slide, please. Here I have another slide which shows the share of behind the meter PV capacity orientation for all of the California IOUs. So I didn't separate this by the different IOUs, but it's combined for all three of the big IOUs. The data shows that since 2015, a majority of systems have been submitting orientation data. And I show the breakdown by direction for all of these. So previously we'd assumed that 100% of the systems were south facing, but the data shows that since 2016, about 42 to 47% of systems were actually south facing and tilted, with systems also facing west at a rate of about 12 to 13%, southwest at a rate of 10 to 11%, and southeast at 8%, and also some east facing and some northeast, northwest facing systems. Also about 8% of the systems have been flat. I want to make a note that these definitions for directions and for tilt have been defined by CEC staff. So in terms of tilt versus flat, if a system had a tilt of 7% or higher, then we classified it as tilted. Otherwise, we classified it as flat. Next slide, please. Similarly, in terms of directions, depending on the azimuth of a system, which is the direction of a system, where a 0 degree azimuth would be true north and 100 degree azimuth would be true south, we classified each system based on its azimuth into 8 different directions that I'm showing on this slide. Next slide, please. Now, for a given forecast zone, we know the following information. From the California DG-Stats website, from the NEM interconnection data set, we know the tilt and azimuth for each of the NEM interconnection data. And we also have capacity factors by tilt and direction, which is the capacity factors we've always used. We've just selected, in the past, we've just selected to use the ones for a south-facing system. Since we have all of this information, we decided to calculate an orientation-weighted average capacity factor for each zone. So here I've just posted sample data. This is not actual data. And for a forecast zone, X, you might have a capacity factor for each direction and for flat systems. From the previous slide, we also know that we know the share or percentage of systems that also are tilted in each direction. So we simply have an equation that I've displayed here, which calculates the weighted average capacity factor for zone by weighting the capacity factor by the percentage of PV capacity facing that direction. Next slide, please. Now, orientation weighted data was calculated on an annual for annual capacity factors. And the results were that the capacity factors were about 2 to 3% less than the capacity factor if all systems were tilted and south facing. And I just want to be absolutely clear what I mean by 2 to 3%. So taking an example, if the capacity factor previously, when it was south facing, was 0.20, the weighted average capacity factor with a reduction of about 2.5% would be 0.195. Note, a 2.5% reduction of capacity factor does not mean that the capacity factor decreased to 0.175, because that would be actually a 12.5% decline. So there is a change. The change is small, but it will affect the calculations for PV generation. So in addition to recalculating annual capacity factors, when we incorporate orientation data, it's also going to affect production on an hourly basis. So on the next slide, I'm going to show how the hourly shapes of PV generation changes. Next slide, please. So here on this slide, I have two different charts, one for PG&E and one for Southern California Edison. This is production for a day in early July versus the, so it shows the hourly shapes for PV generation that we used in the last forecast and the hourly shape for the for PV generation that we'll use in this forecast. So if you look at either one of the charts, you can see that by incorporating PV system orientation data into account, we have slightly less production during midday because there are fewer systems that are south facing, and there's slightly higher production during the morning and evening hours. This is due to there being systems that are some that are east facing and some that are west facing. So when our hourly forecast and hourly estimates are published later in the year, it will incorporate these changes to the PV shapes. So this concludes my summary about the changes to the capacity factors and also concludes my presentation. So I will now take questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Sudhakar. I'll just jump in. I'm really glad you're doing this. I mean, it looks subtle, obviously, in the graphics you just produced, but I think reflecting reality is always a good thing. Within our resources available, and just kudos to the PUC for keeping up the database that started with the California Solar Initiative, and then moving that into the interconnection database as that program sunsetted, and just keeping that alive and keeping that data being gathered is really a terrific resource that enables us to do this kind of work. So kudos to them on that. I did have a question about just reflecting on just the last couple of weeks and the fires and the air quality issues we've had. Many of us live in places where we've been kind of coated with ashes in the mornings, and I'm wondering about how you are accounting for soiling and sort of that capacity factor. Certainly an average across the year, most people I think get up there at some point and clean off their panels, the modules that are up on their roof. But soiling does really matter. If you don't do that for a year or so, you end up with dirty panels and your capacity factor goes down quite a bit, not just a couple percent, but much more significantly than that. So I guess I'm wondering, so if we really are counting on some of these resources, on these hot summer days, and it's compounded with wildfire, that kind of produces a question in my mind about what capacity is actually available from those behind the meter resources. I'm wondering if you guys have thought about that or have sort of considered that layer.
So the data that we use to calculate the capacity factors comes from real world data. It was a study that was done by E3 for the CPUC. And it used an average, it used 5 years worth of data and provided an average capacity factor. So in terms of that, that data would include the effects of soiling. Now, that being said, with increased wildfires, the amount of soiling might be higher now than when this data was collected. So right now, we still use that historical data set, but what we can do going forward is look at data that we can find from publicly available data sets where they have annual and hourly generation, and see if the rate of production is similar to the past or if it's decreased, and possibly make adjustments that way.
Yeah, it seems like maybe this is a topic for a PhD student somewhere, but looking at the impacts of wildfires, you know, so many systems now are sold with monitoring both of the solar system itself, you know, microinverters and different tools that often just come along with the system when people buy it. And then also including even whole house, you know, consumption data and everything. So we ought to be able to, someone ought to be able to get access to a bunch of that, you know, consumer level data and do some, I mean, it wouldn't be that difficult. It seems like, at least in theory, to do some regressions on, you know, pre-post wildfire production levels of PV systems. Seems like that might be an interesting thing for us to turn on a graduate student to, or get an intern to do it or something like that.
A lot of that data that is collected by third-party operators, it is private data, but
yeah,
perhaps we can get some of the major operators to share that data with us, or some of the utilities if they have that data.
Yeah, like in an academic setting, I would imagine, you know, that could be something that you know, with the right non-disclosure agreements, and somebody could get access to that and do the analysis. So anyway, just a thought, but that seems like an important, you know, when we had overlapping issues, right? We had the wildfires, we had the capacity constraints, and you know, we needed all the resources we could possibly get, and we were really at the margins. A few megawatts here and there make a difference. So thanks for all your work. That's it for me.
So Dr., another great presentation chock full of data here for us. I'm wondering on the PV system reclassification. You showed the slide that showed the reclassifications that we were able to do, and then the next slide showed the increase in capacity from the PV systems, right? And is reclassifying them added additional megawatts into how much capacity we anticipate, or was that not the right conclusion to draw from that?
So maybe I went through that slide a little bit too fast. So the answer is it depends on the utility. For the three major IOUs, we really didn't add that much additional capacity. So the two charts were comparing 2 different years. So obviously we add capacity from 2018 to 2019. But if I looked at just 2018 data for the major IOUs, the capacity stayed the same, but there was a lot of reclassification systems. For the POUs, our data set was less robust in the past. So for some of the POUs, especially some of the smaller ones, we definitely added a lot more capacity. The data we had before was all incentive data, and sometimes incentive data is incomplete because not every system applies for an incentive. And by getting interconnection data, we were definitely able to get a lot more systems.
Got it. So it's that we were able to get, as you just said, we were able to capture a lot more systems than we had previously, and that's what caused the bump in the capacity to go up. It wasn't the reclassification of the systems that we already knew about.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sudhakar. It sounds like we're ready to move on to Q&A from Zoom. If Matt, if you could go ahead and read questions we have.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. First question is from Andy Brown. I'm not sure if we have the answer to this, but is there a conversion of behind the meter PV capacity into an effective load carrying capacity adjusted value?
We do not have an answer for that, but I can look into that and reach out to Andy. Or if you could email me, I think my email is posted. We can find an answer for that.
Great, thanks, Sudhakar. The next question is from Sarah Kurtz. Have you verified, this is sort of a follow-on from what Commissioner McAllister was asking, or related at least. Have you verified the accuracy of the solar generation profile? For example, could shading of panels in the morning and evening be affecting the shade?
So in terms of shading of panels in the morning and evenings, that is a specific question on a system by system basis, and that is really information that we don't have. The data that I used was collected by E3 on behalf of the CPUC. So we use that data. It's an average of hundreds, actually it's an average of thousands of systems. So we're using representative averages here. So in terms of specific shading, we don't know that information. And it's highly unlikely we'll know that information, I think, unless we had a lot more data on individual systems, which I don't think that kind of information will ever be collected.
Awesome. Thanks, Sudhakar. Those are all the questions that we have. So thank you, Heather.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sudhakar. So to close out this morning's presentations, we'll be hearing again from Nick Fugate on hourly and peak forecasting. Go ahead, Nick.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. So I have just a brief presentation on our peak and hourly forecast method. These forecasts take both summer loads and our consumption forecast as inputs. So I don't have any preliminary results to show at this point. I'll mostly be describing our tools and methods at a high level and queuing up some of the points we would like to engage stakeholders on through DOG, the Demand Analysis Working Group. So can I go to slide 3? I'm going to talk about 3 pieces of analysis that are all related in the following manner. We begin by weather normalizing the base year peak. This weather normalized peak serves to benchmark our hourly demand forecasts. Our peak forecasts are then taken from the hourly analysis, and also our weather normalization process produces distributions of simulated peaks, which help to level set the 1 in 5, 1 in 10, and 1 in 20 weather variants of our peak forecast. Can you go to slide 4? So we begin with the weather normalization. Typically, we would start this process in October once we receive the full summer's load data from the ISO. We also reach out to LSCs to request load impact estimates from called DR events, which we use to create a counterfactual set of daily peak loads absent any such interventions. The summer may require a little extra outreach to capture some of the unusual interventions that occurred during peak times, including rotating outages. Once we have that counterfactual load data, we model peak load as a function of weather statistics such as minimum temperatures, also max 631, which is a weighted average of consecutive days of max temperatures meant to indicate heat buildup. So 60% of today's max temperature, 30% of yesterday's, 10% of the day before. We use the modeled load weather response to simulate peaks using the last 30 years of historical weather data. And from this distribution, we use 30 years to make sure that we are examining plenty of mild and extreme weather years. And it's from this distribution that we select the median as our weather normalized base year peak. We also examine the ratios between the 80th percentile in the median or the 90th percentile in the median. And we apply these as factors to our 1 and 2 peak forecast to project 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 events, respectively. Can we go to slide 5? One of the things that I wondered about going into this summer is if we would see a significant change in load temperature, in the load response to temperatures due to the pandemic. This would have complicated our practice of combining the last 3 years of data to establish a pattern. But looking at daily peaks so far this summer, the response doesn't appear to be drastically different, at least at the CAISO system level. But at this point, I would strongly encourage stakeholder input, particularly from load serving entities that might be looking at temperature sensitive loads by individual customer sector. It would be helpful to understand how specific sectors may be responding differently during the pandemic, even if at the total system level, which is the level at which we have data, things don't look hugely different. So this is one of the topics that we would really like to discuss in more detail with Doug. Slide 6, please. So I mentioned earlier that the weather normalized peak is used as a benchmark for our hourly load model, or HLM. The details of this model have been discussed pretty rigorously during the 2018 and 2019 IEPR cycles, so I'll just describe it here at a high level. This is our top-down method for developing hourly forecasts. We model consumption, which is reconstituted from system load data and estimates of behind-the-meter generation. We model it as a function of weather and calendar effects, using a separate model for each hour of the day. These models predict load in a given hour as a percentage of average hourly load over the entire year. And then we use these models to develop an 8760 profile, 8760 for every hour of the year, profile of load ratios, which we can then apply to our annual consumption forecast to create the hourly forecast. A couple points worth raising here. The hourly load data that we use to estimate the model right now does not include any 2020 loads, so the predicted values don't reflect what the system profile currently looks like. For example, early morning ramps happening a little bit later in the morning as fewer people commuting to work. This is a long-term forecast, so we're maybe not too uncomfortable with this sort of underlying assumption that we'll see some return to more normal behavior within the next year or two. But, of course, there may be some behavioral or structural changes that persist and alter the load profiles more permanently, but we're not able for this update to predict what those might be. That will have to be reserved for discussion in the 2021 full IEPR forecast. One other point about the HLM, just as a way of transitioning to my next slide, is that it does not offer a convenient framework for assessing impacts from significant changes in demand occurring within specific sectors or subsectors. Let's do slide 7. But we have another tool, a new tool, or actually an old tool that has been refurbished, our hourly electric load model, or HELM. This is a bottom-up method for developing hourly forecasts by applying end-use or whole building profiles to detailed forecasts of annual consumption. Energy Commission forecasters have used the original HELM for a very long time to produce peak forecasts, for so long, in fact, that the underlying end-use profiles had become a little dated. Also, the original model didn't offer any way to directly account for things like transportation electrification or energy efficiency savings, other than by simply assuming the same savings profile as the underlying end-use. So instead, over the last few years, we've been using the HLM exclusively. And during that time, ADM Associates, under an EPIC-funded contract, developed a new set of load shapes. And I've included a link to the project report. And they have now also synthesized those load shapes into HELM 2.0. Let's go to slide 8. So we recently ran HELM with the same set of inputs that we fed into the HLM last cycle. What I'm showing here is a comparison of model outputs for the forecast peak day in 2020. The overall shape is similar, which is encouraging, but this is just one day and also just the CAISO footprint as a whole. So what I would like to do going forward is pull together a more comprehensive set of comparisons to review with DOG and discuss even the potential for using HELM 2.0 to inform our peak forecast update. Slide 9, please. Here I'm showing the same forecast peak day for from the Helm output, but with results broken out by individual customer sector. This is mostly just to illustrate what we're intending to look at during the update process. We can take the updated consumption forecast that Carrie discussed earlier, run the aggregate results through our HLM as we normally would, but then also use these Helm profiles to examine the peak impact resulting from different rates of growth across different sectors. Again, this is something we'd be looking to take up in more detail with within DOG once we've completed some preliminary analysis. Which brings me to slide 10. My final slide here, just a review of next steps and key dates over the next few months. Really the first thing, which I don't have listed here, is our afternoon session today. So far, we have not talked about electric vehicle charging, and that's because our transportation forecasting team will be here this afternoon at 2 to discuss their plans. And the work that they do does feed into our forecast update. Formal comments in response to today's workshop should be docketed by September 16th. That's in 3 weeks. If you'd like to reach out to staff though before to ask questions or offer feedback more informally, we certainly welcome it. The contact information for this morning's presenters, I actually have that on one additional slide. We have another workshop scheduled for December 3rd, at which point we'll be presenting a full set of updated forecast results for final review before the update is considered for adoption by the Commission at a January business meeting. And I mentioned we'd like to have these additional discussions with DOG between now and our next workshop. Our former DOG website was a satellite website, and it existed outside the Energy Commission's main webpage. So we recently migrated that to the CEC's main site, and so I have included a link to that. And if you follow that link, you can subscribe to a listserv to receive meeting notices if you would like. And can we pull up slide 11? So this is just the contact information for our presenters today, in case you'd like to reach out to any of us. I think I'll just leave this up while I ask if there are any questions or comments from the virtual dais.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Nick. Yeah, good stuff. I'm very excited about this hourly work because I think it's really key. I mean, certainly to inform all the different products and grid management, and certainly RA. That conversation is coming in the next weeks and months. So thanks for all that work, and I'm happy to see the progress on Helm as well, Helm 2.0. I guess on that score, I have a couple of questions. So on the load shaping update for Helm, and I guess maybe it's a functionality issue, could you talk about how we might, and this isn't so much on this update, because obviously we're sort of dealing with the tools that we have as of now, but in terms of the conversation going forward, working on load flexibility scenarios with Helm 2.0, and leveraging the DOG process for that. I wanted to get your thoughts on how we can do that effectively in the 2021 conversation. Since it's bottom up, presumably there's some potential to look at specific end uses, specific sectors, or specific end uses anyway, to look at scenarios about if we put in place, if we're managing to get a certain amount of load flexibility, what that might look like, how that might drive peaks, and how that might play into the broader planning issues. Because we really do need to put all hands on deck in terms of developing resources, distributed and demand side resources to enhance reliability. So getting a handle on that and what that would look like in the various regions of the state and LSC territories, et cetera, is really important to do. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on what newish tools now we have, refurbished tools we have that can help us do that.
Yeah, so I think this this Helm tool is pretty exciting, not just for the forecast, but also a number of other potential projects it could be used for. And actually, our team, the CEC team developing the load management standards, reached out to us several months ago to inquire about these load shapes, and we did provide so the ADM load profiles to them for that work. So hopefully we have some consistency between any analysis that they're doing about potential impacts and our forecasting assumptions. But certainly that's something worth circling back to in the 2021 IEPR to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Absolutely. So I kind of that's really the ulterior motive, I guess, of my question, was to encourage us to keep cross-pollinating across the various efforts, across divisions and within divisions, to make sure it's like the benefit of load management standards is going to come when we're able to utilize load management, prices to devices and other types of event-driven demand response, load flexibility, et cetera, take advantage of those distributed energy resources in all their glory, but also help them be accountable so that you can take those as a real resource, and we can work with the ISO and the PUC to show, hey, these can be real resources for planning purposes that can help us optimize the whole grid. And so we need to both develop those tools, but then also hold them accountable as a resource in the mix. And so I think this process is really key for making sure that all of those boxes get checked appropriately, and that we don't get out over our skis too much, but that we are actually able to take advantage of these new resources. There's so much, technology and innovation in the distributed energy space, just with digitization and communications and controls and all that it'd be a really shame to miss the opportunity to scale those and take advantage of them and really account for them in the forecast, and the RA planning. So just looking for every way to encourage everybody to keep coordinating on that.
Yeah, and I think on that point, load impact, some way of verifying load impacts is going to be extremely important for our work. To up until this point, demand response programs have been relatively, few in number and easy to track manually. But if we are issuing real-time prices to customers all over the state, it's something we really need to do a good job of keeping track of and making sure that we're able to reconstitute historical consumption that we can use to calibrate our models.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Thanks a lot. Great presentation. Thanks, Nick. I really appreciate you and the team.
Yeah, excellent work. I don't have any questions.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, commissioners. I think we're ready. This is Heather, ready to take some questions from the attendees through Q&A. Matt, if you'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Nick, here's a question for you from Jan Greiger. Did you adjust especially the early weather scenarios for climate change? There have been some changes over the past 30 years.
There have been some changes, haven't there? So we do incorporate climate change into our peak forecast process and our hourly forecast process. We have to date we have done this through a examination of load response to sort of average temperature increases, leveraging work that was done within the context of the California's 4th climate change assessment. So Scripps Institute of Oceanography provided us with, using some of the same models that they used for that work, provided us with projections of average temperature increases, which we then estimated load impacts in response to that, and added them incrementally to our forecast. But also I think in terms of the weather normalizing the base year, up until this point we have sort of weighted equally all 30 of the previous historical weather patterns. And it's important to retain that kind of that long view of history, because there may be some sort of long run climate cycles that we want to make sure to capture. But in terms of making sure that we reflect this general warming trend, I think it's probably worth discussing weighting. Even if we retain the 30 years of history, weighting more recent years, and doing a simulation that way.
Great. Heather, we have one more. Do we have time?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So this is a question / maybe request from Mark Royst. Nicholas, can you separate out potential storage demand with simple levelized cost of storage? And he's listed a few options here as an example, such as 2 cents per kilowatt hour in 2021, 1.5 in 2022, and then 1 cent in 2023, and so on.
I'm not prepared to do that at this moment. And I think, our storage projections, certainly the method, is a documentation of the method is available in previous IEPR workshop discussions. We're intending to discuss that here today.
Great. All right. Thanks, Nick. Heather, that's all the questions we have, so I'll turn it back to you.
Super. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Matt and Nick. All right, so we're ready to move on to public comment. And so folks using Zoom Online, go ahead and you can click that raise hand icon to let us know that you'd like to make a comment. And if you're joining us by phone, press *9 to let us know you'd like to make a comment. And we have Rosemary Avalos from the Public Advisor's Office here today to help us go through those comments. Go ahead, Rosemary.
Thank you, Heather. At this time, I don't see any raised hands. So I'll give it a few more seconds to see if anyone wants to use the raise hand feature to ask questions. And also a reminder to dial *9 if you're using the phone option. And the *9, you can raise your hand to ask a question. Seeing there are no raised hands, I'll hand it over to Commissioner McAllister.
Well, great. So I do see a bunch of familiar names on the guest list here, so the attendee list rather. Anyway, hopefully everything was crystal clear. But please submit your comments, because I know many folks listening in will have some comments and certainly have some expertise in these areas. I got all my questions answered, and I don't think I really need to ask any further questions, but I just want to encourage people submit comments on this issue and what we'll talk about this afternoon on the transportation front, and really encourage, thanks to everyone. Looks like they're, you know, approaching 100 people or so attending. Still, we started out maybe 150 or so. So good attendance. Want to encourage people to come back in the afternoon to be with us on the transportation sector issues and forecast. So really looking forward to that. Thanks, Heather, for this format really works well. Hopefully everyone's connection is good and they're able to listen in and participate fully as much as they need or want to. Want to thank all the various staff that have presented and whose work is really reflected in the presentations that we've seen. So it's a whole team at the commission and many, many stakeholders that they're drawing on for the assumptions and the underlying work. So thanks a lot. And I will pass it to Vice Chair Scott in case she wants to make some wrap-up comments for the morning. Otherwise, we'll see everyone at 2.
Hi, everybody. No wrap-up comments from now, but I look forward to seeing you at 2 as well.